Welcome back to the Madison Advisory AI Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Verner Thompson, founder of Madison Advisory AI. This show sits at the intersection of leadership, judgment, and technology because while AI and automation are accelerating decisions everywhere, it's still human systems that determine whether those decisions create real value or real harm. Today's conversation is about how we make high stakes financial decisions and why so many of them fail despite sophisticated models, smart people, and enormous resources. My guest is Lachlan Hughson, a former investment banker who has spent much of his career challenging the limits of traditional Excel based modeling. Lachlan works with executives, boards, and investors to introduce probabilistic thinking into financial decisions, helping leaders not just understand possible outcomes, but the likelihood of each one. We'll talk about why static models create false confidence, how better tools change boardroom conversations, where AI fits, and where Lachlan's work with rescued horses has quietly shaped how he thinks about risk, responsibility, and leadership. Lachlan, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Amanda, thank you.
You've worked inside large financial institutions and advised at senior levels. Looking back, what patterns did you start noticing about how big financial decisions were actually being made?
So I think when I first really started to pay attention to this was after business school and thinking I had some more tools to really help the process. And my career at that point was focused on the natural resources industries, so mining and metals, oil and gas, and early stage renewables. And what I found from that process was I ended up working with a lot of engineers. And so I got an exposure to how they think about the world from a more dynamic or probabilistic perspective. And that raised a question that's really stuck in my mind for the last 30 years, which is why don't we use a similar tool or a similar approach in the finance function? Why do we keep just using static models with single inputs into single cells, which results in data that we never actually know how useful it is because we never understand the probability of those different outputs.
Was there a single moment when you realized the tools being used weren't matching the complexity of the problems?
I think it was an evolutionary process, really, a number of iterations of working on something that probably didn't go as well as we thought it would. And then just thinking back to, well, what if we had done it this way? Would that have led to a different outcome? I think where it really hit home was I was working for an oil and gas company early years of the shale revolution, and our stock price went from $67 a share to 67 cents a share. And it really hit me hard that, what if we had done better analysis around just the capital structure, around how prices could change, what that would do? Would that have resulted in us telling our story differently to give investors just a better sense for risk return? And more importantly, when the stock was in the absolute depths, right, we had done analyses that suggested it was worth a lot more than that. And so then how could we bring that probabilistic, dynamic approach to give people a sense for, the probability of X times return is actually quite high, or the stock price today is really in the very low probabilities of where it should be.
Right. That example really hit home in terms of the differentiation and then the risk that there was in the stock price sitting at that level before the drop. Wearing my investment banker hat, most finance professionals live in Excel. What does Excel really do well, and where does it fundamentally break down?
Yeah. So I think Excel does a really great job of helping us pull together the data that we have. I find from a process perspective, a discipline perspective, that it really helps us understand the data that we need, the data that we have, and the answer that we're trying to get to. Where I think it breaks down is because it's only, typically one input per cell, and we then look at our analysis from a base case, an upside or a downside perspective as we try to set the guardrails around what is the best, what is the worst, and what is the most expected result to happen. The other thing that means is depending on why you're using that data. Let's say you're looking to show something has a particular value. right? It gives you more scope to be positive around certain numbers to get you to the result that you want to get to really highlight the message that you're trying to make. Where it falls down is in a number of areas. The first one is because it doesn't really allow us to incorporate all of the data into our model in the way that using a tool like At Risk or Crystal Ball does. It means we have to be a lot more selective around the data that we use, which means that then we end up running iterations and running sensitivities that we actually don't know commercially whether that data actually makes sense. To me, the really negative part about it, if I think about the sensitivity tables that we run, is that we can show a board and executive a really nice table that has a lot of numbers. There'll be the x-axis, the y-axis for the two variables that have sensitivity. And then what we're looking at is, okay, typically good numbers are in green, bad numbers are in red shading, and then yellow is in the middle. But what that doesn't tell us is it doesn't tell us what's the probability, what's the likelihood of any of these numbers actually happening. And when we get a range of values in a table, we don't know, we don't have a tool to understand how well does that table actually capture the range of variability in that metric being reviewed. It could be too wide, it could be too narrow, it could be too high, it could be too low. And so until we actually have probabilities associated with numbers that only really come when we run a Monte Carlo simulation, until we have that, then somewhere we're shooting in the dark because one, we haven't incorporated all of the data that's available. Two, we've typically relied on linear type relationships between inputs when that's not often the case. And three, we've come up with these range of data points that really have no meaning until we can give the user a sense of what's the likelihood of this value actually occurring. And that was where my time with engineers just really reinforced the benefits of being able to go to somebody and say, you know what, there's a 30% probability of dilution here. Don't you want to know that as a board or a CEO? There's a 30% probability that you're going to breach your capital structure. And so
Yeah.
being able to have those conversations led to just a much better, broader process around what are the risks, how do we mitigate the risks, and more importantly, how do we quantify it in a way that we can, understand it really objectively.
What shifts in leaders when they see the distribution of the numbers rather than a single number or pinpoint?
Yeah. So the first thing is if they haven't seen it before and they're new to it, typically their eyes get large. So that's sort of the first physical manifestation that they're seeing something new. But once it's explained and we try to present it in a way that it's either been introduced before the meeting or we've explained the concept so it's not a complete black box when they see it the first time. But it's most of the time it's a real intellectual curiosity around, well, what does this actually mean? And I would have thought that the probability of that outcome was either higher or lower than what my intuition told me going in. The other thing with dynamic modeling using a tool like At Risk or Crystal Ball is the output graphs for the sensitivity, for example, a tornado graph, rank all of the inputs in your model in a way that quantifies their variability to the upside and downside. And so when they see that and they see the ranking of the inputs, often it's a little bit of a wow, I had no idea type moment that this input was a lot more important than these others that I thought intuitively would have a greater role.
Mhm.
And so it just facilitates a much more interesting conversation around, where do we need to focus? What do we really need to get right to mitigate risk? When we're thinking about risk and quantifying that in the way that we do, it also helps them understand how risk changes in a way that they've never really been able to see before. And so for most people, it fires their curiosity, it broadens their perspective on how can I think about building my business? And then it just typically leads to a lot more analyses around, well, what if we introduce this operational change or this strategic change? How can we optimize for the position that we're at to get the result that we want with the lowest risk?
And have you seen, after presenting numbers in that fashion, have you seen decisions change or deals structured differently once the risk is framed in that manner?
I have. And often that's because in that tornado graph that we were talking about, perspectives around inputs that play a significant role have changed. And so it's almost that people now have to go back to the drawing board to rethink, well, what is the thesis behind this? Does this make sense? And as we better understand risk, is there a way that, and maybe it's a divestiture, maybe it's reconfiguring the capital structure, is there something we can do to really leverage the upside and then mitigate the downside, whether it's risk of breaching a covenant, whether it's dilution? And so this dynamic approach actually creates a quite dynamic process within companies once they start to really.
And I found that incredibly interesting, especially with my background in healthcare, where reimbursement and utilization really drive a lot of the outcomes. And inherently in healthcare, there's uncertainty. How would probabilistic modeling change how healthcare leaders think about M&A?
So, from a pure strategic perspective, or if we think about more from the decision making metrics, from an accretion dilution, a risk, a leverage perspective, they can now incorporate all of the variability into the whether it's product price, whether it's volume sold, whether it's operating cost or capex. They For more established companies, they have a pretty good understanding of what that variability is. And so now they can fully incorporate it into their model. To the extent that it's more an early stage type project, and it's interesting when you look at the research around stochastic modeling and real option valuation, there's a lot of mining and oil and gas type of examples and papers, but there's also a lot of healthcare papers.
Oh, yeah.
Right? As people have to do a similar analysis because we're making a big bet on a certain path that's going to incur a high capital cost. What data do we need to make the right decision? And what does the variability in our data tell us about risk and return and probability of success? And so I think there's multiple ways from a healthcare perspective, from any industry perspective, wherever there's variability in financial and operating inputs that are going to have a material impact on the success or failure of the transaction, this tool allows us to incorporate all of that into one model, right? Rather than running half a dozen different models trying to mimic what a Monte Carlo simulation does. And it now really quantifies the probabilities of achieving the results that you're looking for.
And how well do you think investment banks or financial advisors are adopting probabilistic models as opposed to the static
Yes.
modeling?
That's a great question. There's definitely a reticence. There's certainly a lot of inertia around this is how we've always done it. And this is what our process is in terms of putting together a fairness opinion and going through that whole process. What's interesting, though, is there is an increasing awareness, and maybe it's earlier stage, of what sort of companies do we want to actually think about as a target,
Mm.
right? Where do they fit on an efficient frontier from a risk return perspective and the other M&A type metrics? And it's almost that should be a first step. That then really helps management teams identify which companies make the most sense. And that's then a great time for bankers to be part of the process as they do their fairness opinion. They bring all of the competitive intelligence to
Mhm.
actually how do we get this done in this particular situation. So I think it's early days. It's a matter of finding the right place for a tool like that. It's not about reconfiguring the whole M&A process. It's just about recognizing there's a part of the valuation process that this can provide really great insights to help you, mitigate the risk of, 60 to 70% of M&A failing, trying to move those odds in your favor more.
Hmm. Yeah, and for an industry so large, sometimes it moves very slowly, but I can see this really taking control in the future. And one thing about taking control in the future is AI entering the marketplace. AI has entered finance in many ways, writing documents, analyzing data, accelerating workflows. Where do you see AI genuinely helping today?
So I think that the banks have done a really good job on figuring out where to use it. I think right then the question becomes, how is it going to be used in the modeling process? Since the financial model and its outputs, right, that's the tool that synthesizes all of the data into a form that decision makers can use, that ultimately then decisions are made of. I think that AI will be a really good tool for being able to process data better, and maybe give us access or insight into other data sources that we didn't know previously. But I think in terms of financial models, because so much rides on them being correct, that there's always going to be, a human element in that. And so that's where I think developing more probabilistic models using an Excel add-in, it could speed up the process, it can help with data delivery, but ultimately it's going to have to be humans at this stage anyway, understanding what this tool does, learning how to use it and incorporating it
Hmm.
before AI can play more of a role in the modeling part of the process.
So, do you see probabilistic modeling as a bridge between traditional finance and static modeling and AI enabled decision making?
I think it's a bridge, but there's two spans to the bridge. The first span is recognizing that Excel today, as it is a 40-year-old tool, right? It's sort of interesting given how much sales and trading has evolved, given how much our personal lives have evolved, that we're still using this 40-year-old tool to make decisions around trillions of dollars worth of investment. My sense is the finance function, the evolutionary step would be converting it from a static approach to a dynamic approach, to actually having it be more disciplined, having it be more quantified, and being able to use so much of the data that we have, being able to now that incorporate into our models that we can get the insight from that data, and that insight can contribute to the outputs. In terms of the second span of the bridge, I think like it's everything's up for grabs right now. It's a really exciting time. I think the speed at which that happens, because models and control of models is so important and the output is so important, that it'll take longer than other parts of the business. But at some point, you can see where a lot more people are using it, that AI will also play a role. And maybe it's more from a data inclusion analysis perspective than actually running the Monte Carlo simulations.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting development to see what AI really does play a role in the evolution of AI in that role of
Yes.
financial modeling. I'm going to take a turn here. You do something very different on the weekends, working with rescued and abused horses. How did that become part of your life?
So that was actually something that was COVID related. That's really was the catalyst for starting it. I'd always had that interest, and my connection with horses primarily came out of working with them. And I think part of it is we just get to a certain age where giving back is a lot more enjoyable, and helping just becomes far more enjoyable than doing all the time. I also felt that, if we look at the history of our society, horses have been the species that have played the greatest role in getting us from where we were to where we are today. And yet we continue to treat them really appallingly, whether it's Mustangs in the West, whether it's broken down horses coming off the racetrack, right? They really are treated as a thing rather than another sentient being. And I think for humans to, find a way out of some of the dark places we find ourselves today, having a connection with another living being who doesn't have a voice, who doesn't have the power that you do, is actually really good for our soul in a lot of ways, and just makes us a better human being, makes us a better species collectively. And so it was really all of that wrapped up in the opportunity of living in Colorado, and just hitting that time in my life where I really wanted to help. And so that's now most weekends, except for the cold in the winter.
It seems like a great
Right.
way to spend your weekend, so I'm a bit jealous there, but it also seems like it's taught you a lot. So what have horses taught you about trauma, patience, and trust?
I mean, that's a really important question, because I've found that how I work with boards and executives, that working with horses has actually changed how I do that. And so now, right, when you're transactionally oriented, you come up as an associate and a VP and you go through that process. The sharp end is very much about getting things done. And I've gotten to a stage, and Monte Carlo simulation dynamic modeling is part of that, of I get more pleasure out of just helping people than actually and helping them find a new way to build a more successful company or to manage a problem that they've never been able to, than just putting the same stuff against the wall, hoping that something will stick. And working with my equine friends, especially from an energetic and an emotional and EQ perspective, helping them there, that has gone a long way, I think, to just putting me in the right emotional state, the right energetic state, to really think about clients and the people and the companies who need the help, doing it in a way that is respectful to them, is respectful to the process. Just it's very, very different to pitching and pitching and pitching and hoping that something will stick. And there's a huge amount of personal satisfaction, I think, that just comes out of helping somebody or something feel better, be happier than they were when you first went into their life.
It seems like you have a lot of balance between the financial analysis, probabilistic modeling, working with boards, and then your equine friends and horses. Do you think that better decisions come from having that sort of balance, both in the financial boardroom and otherwise?
I think the best decisions come from having really objective data in a form that gives you a sense for the likelihood of something happening. When I'm out in the paddock with my tuning forks or we're doing hands-on work, it's a little different, but it's coming from that same place of how can I help you get to a better place? So when I work with my equine friends, it's how do I help you heal? How do I help you release a trauma, let go of something that isn't serving you energetically, which then leads to an emotional or a body release? The connection to working with clients, I think, is having that same mindset of I'm here to help you. I actually don't know everything that you're dealing with. I'm not going to presume that I can just come in and tell you what I think and show that I'm an expert in this. That never works. It doesn't work with my equine friends. It doesn't work with my professional friends. It's all about how can I go in a respectful way, an open way, asking questions and connecting with them at their level, which then opens those doors to amazing conversations, amazing responses, where everybody leaves that 45 or 50 minutes just feeling really good about what happened.
That's a refreshing perspective to bring to finance overall, and I really like how that rings truth with what you've said about your experience in the boardrooms. If you were advising a younger financial professional today, what would you want them to understand about risks, tools, and longevity that you didn't early on?
Again, that's a really great question, right? If only. So I think the first thing I would recommend is just to stay curious. Right? We all know that the tools will change, that things will be upgraded. I think just always be curious around what is going on about you. There will always be primary tools, there will always be a main way of doing things, and it's really important to function within that framework. But it also doesn't help just to be curious around what are we really trying to solve for here. If you like the emotional quotient part of the conversation rather than just making it all intellectual. And I think that's then leads to the person themselves just then being very staying curious about themselves, right? Intrinsically, what is it that they find fascinating about this? What is it that they really enjoy about this? And staying true to that through the hard times and being willing to being willing to go in a different direction when the path that you're on starts not to serve you in a really material.
And it can be difficult for junior bankers or bankers early in their career to question some of the tools that came before them, but it is always important to remain curious and always bring, like you said, your passion really behind the project to the ideas.
Exactly. And I think that's what's really healthy about, and the other thing I would focus on, and you hit on it a little as well, is how do we maintain our vitality? And that's what I've really learned from working with my equine friends is seeing what stress and trauma and just being constrained in a way that isn't healthy for sentient beings, like what that does to our vitality and how much that drains our energy. And so I think for younger practitioners, it's the same thing. You're so lucky to have that vitality. You're so lucky to have had the education, and now you have the opportunity. Just being aware that the root of all of that and your longevity is how can I protect, conserve, maintain my vitality doing what I'm doing? Because for most people, success is right. It takes a long while to get there, and its definition will change over time. We don't really know what I think success is in our 30s. And so it's staying open to all the magnificent things that happen to us, trusting those voices that point you in a different direction from time to time, and just doing everything to keep yourself and the people around you as happy and healthy and energized as they can be.
Yeah, it's always when you have the most vitality that maybe you don't appreciate it as much as you should. But for those younger bankers and our listeners, it's something to take value of what you have now. And talking about the definition of success changing throughout the years, when you look ahead 3 to 5 years, what does meaningful success look for you now?
I think it's in many ways it's what I'm doing now. I'll continue to work with my equine friends, do a better job at that, find a way to maybe find an extra day every 2 weeks to go to a different rescue and help out there. From a professional perspective, it's just continuing to tell the story of dynamic modeling, get more companies and more executives and investors to be really excited in how much this can help you fundamentally create a sustainable competitive advantage through the finance function and just work with different people that have financial problems to be solved that they unable to solve today and just keep trying to be helpful to them as to how can we do a better job in finance? What's the tool, what's the approach that gives us better insights uh, at a lower cost, at, at a much lower cycle time, so we can spend more time thinking and actually doing the value added to make better and just better decisions.
Do you see another tool following the probabilistic modeling and Monte Carlo tool that you use now?
I think it'll I think that will expand. So when you run a Monte Carlo simulation, I worked with one company for an example, and I think we had about 10 inputs. We did it monthly over 10 years. And when we ran the number of simulations that we ran, basically we had almost 1 billion pieces of data. And so the advances on just a tool like At Risk or Crystal Ball is now we can use that output data. Now we can really get into that, whether it's whether it's some sort of a further analysis or using decision trees or something like that. We can actually use that data almost as a second degree way of figuring out, well, what metrics really drive the success of a business, right? We know that growth is important, scale is important, operating efficiency, capital efficiency, the right liquidity profile. They're all critical. But once you run that Monte Carlo simulation, once you have this data for all of the inputs and the outputs, then you can start to analyze that further to really figure out what are the strategies that will give me the highest probability of success. And so I think it's more using the output data, not just as in the initial distributions or in the initial sensitivities to make that first decision. It's getting into it, using it a lot more, and really gleaning as much insight from that data as you.
It's really taking the output and the information and going to the next level with that information that you then have.
Exactly. I think about, the old calculus days. I think about dynamic modeling as the first differentiation, and then the next level will be the second. And I'm sure that, the data managers, the engineers amongst us, once we have that data, they will find multiple ways to slice and dice in ways that, we can't even think of today.
I'm sure, and maybe one of our AI friends will even develop another way that we can slice and dice. We will see. But
Exactly.
L- Lachlan, thank you for such a thoughtful conversation and wide-ranging conversation for us. What stands out to me is that it isn't really about better models for their own sake. It's about better tools and better advice to give executives and for the feedback and value of their own company. So whether it's probabilistic modeling in finance or helping rescued horses, your work points bring the same idea. When old tools stop working, we have an obligation to find new ones. And I really appreciate you being here on the podcast today. For our listeners that enjoyed this conversation, please share the episode. And until next time.